Hello and welcome to another edition of TPA Talks. This week I'm going to be speaking to Alex Phillips. Alex is a former member of the European Parliament. She's a broadcaster, journalist, activist, campaigner, consultant, done all sorts. So we'll be covering a lot of ground. We'll be talking about her time in Brussels and how she dealt with that during the Brexit negotiations. We'll be talking about the future of the media in the UK and around the world, as well as a discussion about the BBC and her future plans as well. So Alex, thank you for joining us. Thank you very much indeed. Obviously you've had quite a meandering and very interesting and varied career thus far. Politics, what got you into that specifically and various iterations that you've done for that over the years?
Gosh, it's really hard to actually pinpoint a start point for all of that. My mum tells me that when I was at primary school, I used to sort of totter home and there was some TV programme on, like a Politics Live of its day in the 80s or whatever, or early 90s. And I used to watch it obsessively and do impersonations of some of the people on the front bench, especially Tom King, who I used to master his gurn with precision. And then at some point, I think the local MP was standing outside the local supermarket and was organising trips to the House of Commons. So Mum took me along knowing I had an interest. Like all sort of peculiar children, I had my things that I collected, and I went through a phase of cutting the word Maastricht out of the newspaper. I might have liked the double A, who knows, but it's all over my notice board. So I think there was this interest, this awareness at least, at a very young age. But I really only felt compelled to be politically active much later and after university, which most people I think start to engage if they're going to end up in politics during university. But mine was as a young journalist between university and my journalism school working in Africa. And I was in Ghana working for a TV station there, and the big debate in all Ghanaian papers, on the radio stations, on the television, was about the EU signing an EPA, an Economic Partnership Agreement with ECOWAS, the Economic Union of West African States. And there was a huge amount of pushback from Ghana, who really did not want this deal to go through as it was for various reasons. They were basically being stripped of all of their income from tariffs, which at the time were about a third of GDP. And every little aspect of those negotiations were writ large in the Ghanaian media, and accusations of devious behaviour and switching out negotiators and bullying tactics and forcing other members of ECOWAS to sign up, otherwise they would be stripped of aid. And I think it was the first time really, despite being sort of aware of Euroscepticism, that I thought, ooh, the EU's not a really good place, is it? And perhaps, it's not a great idea that we're in it. And then it wasn't long after I came back home, trained to be a broadcast journalist, worked at ITV and the BBC, and in the process of my reporting, bumped into one Nigel Farage, and that, as they say, is history.
Well, indeed. So on that note, obviously it was the 2019 European elections where you went over to Brussels.
Yeah.
As an MEP.
Yeah.
I think the Tories got, what was it 8% and 9% of the vote? Sort of worst ever, or one of the worst ever national elections for them. So obviously your time over in Brussels, I mean, obviously it was quite a short stay.
Thankfully.
How did you find that?
Do you know what? It was possibly one of the most bizarre, fascinating, amazing and frustrating periods of my whole life. We all got elected knowing that we wanted our tenures to be short. That was the purpose of the Brexit Party being elected. And we had more members of the Brexit Party than any other national political group, even Angela Merkel's CDU. So we're a real force in the chamber. And there was a real camaraderie. I'm used to politics being quite cutthroat and quite discordant and combative. But there was a real sort of sense of brothers in arms, all of us in the trenches together. And it was a huge amount of fun. We'd all go and support each other when we were making speeches in Strasbourg, often to an empty chamber. What people don't realise is MEPs get this 1 minute of speaking time, and more often than not, they come in with their little bit of paper, read their 1 minute, want it to be filmed for their social media and clear off, and there's nobody else in there. But we would all flood the chamber when one of us was scheduled to speak, and there might be one or two other people waiting to speak, but we were this real sort of force of nature. But also, I really got to look under the bonnet properly firsthand of what it's like to be elected to the European Parliament. And everything that you hear is true. Chauffeur-driven cars and, money for signing in and private champagne
Because
bars.
I remember, I think it was Lance Foreman, who maybe was at one of the main train stations in Brussels or something, sort of a whole flotilla of cars ready and waiting for MEPs to be scooped away over to the main European districts. So basically the kind of excess is exactly what you thought it would be.
I think they know what they're doing. They make you feel like you're turning up for the Oscars. MEPs have their own separate entrance with a red carpet, and it's all Madame, Monsieur. When they've got all these little, coffee lounges and things dotted around the Parliament estate, they've got a separate queue for the MEPs, so you can just go along, and I'm an MEP, and skip the queues. Actually, I never did that because I always felt kind of uncomfortable, but I saw a few times Guy Verhofstadt sort of, pigeon-chested, waddling over, do you know who I am? But no, frankly, you easily could stay in a luxury hotel basically paid for, phone in the morning, get a chauffeur to come pick you up, go in, sign a clipboard, I'm here, I'm attending for the day. Go to the MEP champagne bar, have a few flutes of champagne, get back in a chauffeur-driven car, go back to your 5-star hotel, and have been paid about €300 to have done it per day.
Sorry, there was an actual champagne bar though.
There was various bars that were the members' bars as they're called, and no doubt heavily subsidised. And you could actually, because of course you had your MEP salary, which was paid at its special European Parliament rate of tax. Then you had the paperclip allowance, which just gets deposited into a bank account for generalised expenses. You don't have to produce a receipt for it. Then you get the allowance for signing in every day. And if you were very wily as an MEP and used every single source available to you without even having to lift a finger and do any work, you could have probably pocketed in the region of £250,000 to £1 million, net at the end of a term. It's utterly exorbitant. It is ludicrous. But what I would say is the Brexit Party were without doubt the hardest working MEPs that I've seen. Maybe not working in the sort of direction of travel that most of the other MEPs, the Europhile MEPs, were pushing towards. But we always turned out. We were always in the chamber. We didn't miss a beat.
Yeah, interesting. So where are we now? So his formal departure was end of January 2020. So two and a half years in now. Obviously, before that we had various iterations of meaningful vote 1, 2, and 3, and everything else before that. How do you think we're doing now? Obviously, the government now is sort of alluding to more changes, and I think not rolling over EU legislation in the same way that has been happening previously. So in theory, it seems a bit more tangible almost, doesn't it, with what the government is saying at the moment.
Right.
In the last 2.5 years, and where we might be in 2.5 years' time, how do you feel the project's going?
Well, first of all, what I would say is you have to give a degree of reprieve to Boris Johnson, because I remember leaving that Parliament building, as you said, at the end of January 2020 and straight into COVID and lockdown, basically. It was a whisker of time until the world was thrown into utter chaos. And so it wasn't really a time that people were thinking about using the tools at their disposal. And of course, this was also the transition period where we should have really been knuckling down. And if it hadn't been COVID, every square inch of newspaper column would have been about the great battle to trying to sort out the dog's dinner of a ready-cooked, oven-made deal, whatever it is, that Boris Johnson had tied us up to. But, that period wasn't particularly granted to us because of COVID. So there was this pregnant pause. We did see some glimmers of what being an independent nation looked like in terms of our vaccine procurement process, which in stark contrast to the EU's was hugely successful. And then seeing the way that the EU retaliated, to them it was a real sense of shame and bitterness that we had our vaccines in arms, and they were preventing consignments coming out of the Serum Institute in India and various other places, claiming that they belonged to them and they were going to be going to the UK, when in fact they were due to go to developing world countries. I mean, the behaviour of the EU during this period was utterly deplorable. So I think we did begin to see a glimmer of reality of this is what being independent can look like, essentially not being in the quagmire of their rubbish decision making. But I don't think we've really had time yet to take stock and do anything with the tools that we've been furnished with. There's been too much mopping up. There is still too much mopping up. And again, I think we can, to a degree, excuse Boris Johnson for the hangover of some of this, because he was in a corner when there was a time that Brexit in its entirety was under threat. And so what was pushed through Parliament had a lot of, mistakes and loopholes and far too much binding conditionality from Theresa May's late deal. And, he had to get something through, and he did. And we're still seeing now the repercussions of the Northern Ireland Protocol. But we are beginning to put things in place, like the bonfire of EU regulation. Is that going to be substantive enough? I think very often these things tend to be bits and bobs around the edges. And the project now of actually building and utilising the tools of our independence will be long term. I don't think any Brexiteer expected it would happen overnight. I also think that there, in these situations, is always some risk to trying to make these things happen overnight. There is naturally going to be a period where businesses and organisations need to adapt, but adapt they will. This idea that, political policy decimates business is quite frankly ludicrous. Businesses have to stay agile and change, and for decades now had to respond to constant reams of diktat coming out of Brussels and had to manage their working practices in accordance. So having to change in the other direction shouldn't be too problematic. But there is a sense of frustration that more could be done. Certainly, there is some big, obvious, low-hanging fruit that could have been grasped, slashing VAT on energy bills. I mean, actually, moving aside from the homogenisation of corporation tax is a clear signal that we do have a government now that seems to get it and wants to use some of our newfound freedoms to, really genuinely economically compete with the EU, not stay as an arbitrary satellite. But the problem we now have with the war raging in the Ukraine is that, again, it's sort of the strategy is being put forward now for growth that would be great if it was a period where we were, making hay while the sun shines, but we're in a crisis, and you think, it's not really the fecund environment in which to start sowing the seeds of our future. So there have been a number of hurdles that must be traversed, but at least what we can see ideologically is some determination to achieve those things. The problem is the clock's ticking. There's 2 years to try and make people see the reality of what Brexit could mean. The circumstances are far from ideal for that. And the big risk, of course, is if they stuff it up, we're going to end up with a government who does not have the same appetite, and if anything, might look to start creeping back in a Brusselsward direction.
Well, I mean, that'd be, interesting and certainly possible if as and when the Labour Party sort of gets back into power. Obviously, sort of very interesting noises from Keir Starmer and some of the other Labour front bench in terms of being very accepting of Brexit now, but how tangibly that may or may not change is slightly unknown at this stage. Switching slightly to obviously what you're alluding to with your journalistic background and broadcasting work. I mean, obviously news media in the UK, many other places too, but focus in this country has changed quite substantially in recent years. What do you think some of the main drivers of that change are? I mean, obviously there's a lot of hullabaloo about fake news and bad reporting on some of the larger social media websites. On the other hand, the way that a lot of people actually consume proper tangible news is through clipping and sharing clips and so forth. So how people access that has fundamentally changed, but do you think that kind of trajectory is unstoppable, or I don't know, is there some kind of appeal to the core elements of good independent broadcasting which people kind of accepted as and took for granted 20, 30 years ago? How do you think the landscape's changing recently or will change in the future?
It's an interesting question, and actually thinking as you were asking the question, there's this almost osmotic process going on where television's being heavily influenced by the new algorithm, digital age we live in. And at the same time, people still want the veracity of real journalism. And somehow the social media companies are going to have to catch up with that. People are very suspicious, I think, of some of the censorship that's taken place, and rightly so, via social media. But at the same time, I think a lot of new channels emerging and new projects emerging are trying to capture that social media zeitgeist and create more opinion-driven content. The difficulty is that broadcasters risk venturing into the territory of losing nuance and losing probity and losing discretion. And if social media somehow manage to come around the back and somehow demonstrate that they can provide that, then it will be the death knell of traditional mainstream media. I think that there needs to be a very clear furrow driven between what it is that professionally qualified journalism, it is a profession these days, gone are the days where people worked as an apprentice, you go and you get a qualification, and it's almost, there is no such thing as an oath that you take as a journalist, but there is this sort of almost Hippocratic sense of wanting to do things according to the trade that you are part of, correctly and properly, that journalists who have been to journalism school, who have paid good money to get that professional qualification, want to sign up to and want to stay true to. And we do, of course, have some of the best regulators in the world. Very often you hear people go, oh, Ofcom this, Ofcom that. Thank the Lord for Ofcom. Because what Ofcom do is make sure that when you're watching TV, it's not offensive and it's not patently untrue. But actually, they're not heavy-handed, they're not editorializing, they're not telling channels what they can and can't do. They're just making sure that the bare minimum standards of journalism that we should all expect and that all providers should uphold is guaranteed.
That's interesting. So, Ofcom or not, do you sense, I mean, it's a slightly trite word, but an Americanization of news?
Yeah.
Could that progress more in this country, or do you think there would be certain barriers institutionally, isn't it? Ofcom or others which would?
There's clearly at the moment a degree of experimentation taking place to see if that is the direction of travel. I think people very much believed it was, and that there would be a huge appetite for that among a British audience. But I sometimes correlate this back to politics. And when you look at British voters, yes, they came out in droves for Brexit, but they came from all different parts of the political spectrum, united by an ideological cause, each for their own reasons very often. But when you look at fringe parties in the UK, of which I've been part, of course, you realise that they hit a ceiling of about 15% very quickly. And then they cannot seem to progress. Most people are sort of baked in traditionalist centrists. And when you look at what's just come to pass with the Queen's death and her funeral, you realise that Brits very often pivot back to Britishness. And Britishness is this sense of decorum, a sense of fairness, and a sense of sort of holding our head up high in the world and saying that we have qualities and standards that we like to uphold. And I do wonder that if new organisations push too far against what is actually just a sort of baked in mainstream mentality of the Brits, they're not going to find there's an American audience sitting waiting for them. It's a British audience. And so it's finding that balance between offsetting what a lot of the mainstream media is accused of doing, which frankly is proselytising from a very left-wing bent to an audience, offsetting that but still staying very true to what is the large bulk of British consensus opinion, which is just resolutely traditional, centrist, and not particularly wanting screeching and rhetoric. And a good friend of mine once said to me, when you look at the culture wars going on, people are fed up of this huge push coming from the neo so-called liberal elites who are forcing their doctrines and their agendas on people in the public. And largely this tends to be a very London-centric and social media thing. You go out to rural Shropshire and people aren't discussing trans issues. They're just not. But those people who oppose it seem to want to fight fire with fire and scream equally as loudly as the combatants on the sort of neo-Marxist left wing who are trying to force feed everyone these doctrines, when what people want is normalcy. They just want normalcy. And I think this is something that we've lost in the mainstream media with its sort of left-leaning agenda. And it's something I don't think right now which is being properly provided by those trying to counter that.
So following on from that, you sort of speaking of sort of sense of decorum, and that's kind of an innate sense of self in the UK. Now, I'm sure that arguably some of the chief defenders of the BBC and the BBC itself would put this forward in terms of kind of an almost timeless, innate institution of the UK is the BBC. Now, with various iterations of competition, obviously Sky News has been around since mid-90s. GB News, of course, launched last year, and other competitors. License fee, as it's currently constituted, is that viable anymore? I think is the degree of competition such that to demand a TV tax, in effect, for people to actually enjoy using that, is that really viable anymore?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I actually do not have a firm position on it. You'd think I would do. I do think that it's pretty outdated and anachronistic to make people pay a TV tax for a national public service broadcaster. I do. I think, and especially when that public service broadcaster is failing to represent the views of its people, which has almost been an inevitable thing about the professionalisation of media, that you're not getting the Jeremy Clarkson, wrote for the local rag age 15, moving up through the echelons, but you are getting graduates now, and those graduates come with ideological baggage, which then creates this sort of accidental groupthink. The BBC isn't sitting there going, we must be left-wing. It's a natural sort of development from the people who are filling those offices and those studios. And so there's an argument that it does seem utterly outdated and ridiculous, especially with the amount of on-demand content. But at the same time, there's part of me which thinks, before you throw something away, wonder what's going to replace it and how it's going to be replaced and what you might lose in the process. So I think that there needs to be a national conversation about the licence fee and who gets it. Of course, Channel 4 have been recipients of this for that ghastly news programme that they make. And I can't see under any circumstances that should be subject to getting essentially taxpayers' money when it's so evidently overtly biased. It tries to be. But at the same time, as someone who has lived across the Commonwealth and worked in politics and in journalism across the Commonwealth, I think the BBC World Service is an incredible tool of soft power, incredible diplomatic leverage on a level that it's very hard to imagine until you've operated in those countries. The love that people in Ghana, in Kenya, in India, countries I've lived and worked as a journalist and in politics, have for Britain, because they look at their own media and look at the BBC and innately, inherently trust the BBC and its values. And as a result, whether it's the BBC that reflects positively on Britain or vice versa, there is this incredible tool that a lot of other countries are trying to replicate. Al Jazeera, Chinese television, France 24, they would love to have the power of the BBC World Service. They would love to have that. And they don't, and they are not getting there. So if we suddenly, throw this out, the baby goes out with the sink or whatever the phrase is, that's not it, is it? But baby out of the bathwater. Mixing up my metaphors there. The kitchen sink is also in. If we get rid of that, then we are foolishly throwing away something out of a sense of discontent and distrust of and with the BBC that we'll find it very difficult to rebuild once it's gone. So I think it is about having a conversation. Do there need to be a gazillion BBC channels in every language under the sun provided here in the UK? No. I don't know why we've got BBC everything from A to Z. I don't know why there are all these sort of random channels that I don't even know what's broadcast on them. Can it be slimmed down? Yes. But the route that they're taking to slim it down at this stage seems to me very peculiar, by mixing BBC News, the rolling news channel, with BBC World Service, when if you're going to be taking taxpayers' money, provide the national 24-hour round-the-clock news service, and provide your international presence as well. But those are the two bits they're lumping together. That to me seems mad when there are a whole lot of Gary Linekers out there who could be, given their notice by the end of the week.
Yeah. That's a very interesting point. I think a lot of the other areas as well of policy, what exactly is soft power for Britain today? I think that's a very, very reasonable point in terms of what that is. Just sort of finally, now you've done all sorts, Alex. You've been a journalist, you've been a consultant, you've been a campaigner, you've been a politician, you've been a broadcaster, of course. What's next for you?
Probably all of that in some sort of fantastical mosaic until I really finally decide what it is that I want, and perhaps I never will, but I know that there are various strings to my bow. At the end of the day, it all sort of revolves around media and politics and media, and the UK, Britain, the Commonwealth. Whatever I do is going to somehow involve some sort of iteration of that, and I quite like mixing and matching. Keeps me fresh and keeps me interested, and never a dull day.
That's great. Alex, thank you very much for joining us. Really enjoyed that, and hope you did too. Well, thank you to Alex Phillips for this edition of TPA Talks. If you enjoyed that, then please remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one.